That seems to be what is happening, certainly in a few key areas around the zone, around Kharkiv, as well as in the south around Kherson. We don't have the exact details of how many towns and villages have been regained and how many kilometers have been regained, but the estimate seems to be that there might be something like 20 kilometers worth of gains in some areas, which is pretty significant. But at the moment, Zelensky is keeping a reasonably tight lid and hasn't revealed exactly what territory has been captured because, of course, this is an ongoing offensive.
And is there a sense that Ukrainian forces can sustain such a counteroffensive?
There is a real sense that this is a pretty definitive part of the war. We are seeing some pretty significant weapons that the Ukrainians have been given access to, specifically, particularly by the US, and that they are using right now in this counteroffensive. And there's this feeling that the importance of this particular moment is that the Ukrainians are trying to recapture territory before the weather turns really cold in around about October. That is sort of this deadline that both sides currently have, because round about mid-October is when some of this area will become really very difficult to traverse. So everyone is trying to get things in order before this October cold comes through.
And as you said, these gains are a byproduct of the support from Ukraine's allies, Europe, the US, and Australia. Given what you've just said as well, would that give the West and other Ukrainian allies the impetus to give them even more support in terms of weapons?
That is certainly what the Ukrainians are trying to do. So they're showing their Western allies that these weapons are making a huge difference. And what they're trying to do is to convince the Western allies to continue sending supplies and, in fact, to increase the quantity and the quality of the weapons that are being sent. And that comes against a backdrop of the European Union warning over the last week. Josep Borrell, who is the EU's foreign affairs chief, he warned earlier this week that the EU is actually starting to run out of weapons. So a lot of those supplies may start slowing down. And so it's very important for Ukraine to show that these weapons are making a huge difference.
And let's move away from the fighting for a moment. I want to go to Vladimir Putin's speech in Vladivostok overnight. He's now said he wants to revise the grain deal with Ukraine, blockade the Black Sea and cut off oil and gas supplies to Europe, warning that Europeans could quote, freeze like a wolf's tail. How do you see this playing out for Russia and Europe? Who will blink first?
So yesterday, Vladimir Putin delivered this quite fiery speech on stage in Vladivostok at this annual shindig that gets held there every year. It's an economic forum, but it's really an opportunity for the various bigwigs of Russia to sort of come out and make statements. Putin's speech was really aggressive, and basically what he's doing is threatening actually African nations for the most part, because these grain supplies that are getting out of Ukraine are largely heading for Africa as well as for the Middle East. And it's been a really key element of this war, being able to unlock some of these grain supplies, because a lot of countries in the Middle East and a lot of countries in Africa face starvation without those supplies. So what Putin was signaling was essentially, we'll starve Africa if you don't stop supplying Ukraine with these weapons. And essentially the signal was that he is not above using food and starvation as a weapon. He's not above using gas as a weapon and starving and essentially freezing people as a means of using these things as pawns in the war. In terms of how far he's willing to go, look, I think what he has shown us is he's willing to go as far as necessary to reach his aims. But what we are also seeing is that the EU has woken up in large parts to these sorts of threats. And certainly when it comes to things like energy supplies, there has been a real concerted effort leading up to the winter to secure alternative sources of energy to the oil and to the gas and to the coal that they get from the Russians. And so we've seen this real urgency on account of the starvation in Africa and the Middle East. That's a trickier question, because if Putin does decide to rip up this grain deal that he signed, or this Black Sea deal unlocking Ukrainian grain, that will be very difficult for the Middle East and for Africa, and it's unclear how they might get alternative supplies.
Yes, we can see those consequences in Somalia. And now you've seen a shopping list of tech items, specifically microchips, that the Russians are having a hard time getting their hands on. What does this tell us about the way sanctions are working?
So this is a really big story that we published earlier this week. I have seen a list drawn up ostensibly by the Russians, which essentially ranks in order of importance the sorts of parts that they're hunting to restock, essentially, because what we've seen is that when we open up Russian artillery, when we're looking at the sorts of things that are being found in Ukraine, either abandoned or deployed weaponry, that they are very much reliant, particularly in their very high-tech gear, on Western components, and particularly Western microchips, but all sorts of components, casings, connectors, all sorts of things come from Western companies. And so what the Russians are now finding is that because they've had 6 months of this war, they didn't expect it, they've ended up deploying far more of their weapons than perhaps they had anticipated. And so they're really struggling to restock on some of these key elements which allow them to rebuild their military supplies. And for instance, I spoke with Denis Shmyhal, who is the Ukrainian prime minister, and he said that the Ukrainian intelligence points to the fact that there are really only maybe 48 hypersonic missiles left for the Russians to deploy. So that's really significant. In terms of what it shows us, is it shows us firstly that the sanctions are proving to be slowing down the Russians because they're not able to get alternative supplies for some of these parts. So it's probably a double whammy of sanctions and also this microchip shortage, which is really affecting the Russian army and their artillery supplies.
Zoya, really good to get your analysis as always. Thanks so much.
It's my pleasure. Thank you very much.